Morning, everyone. Uh, Today I'm going to be talking to you about some tracking work that we've done with the endangered Hawaiian petrels on Lana'i. And this is all work that we've conducted with our partners at Palau Lana'i in 2019 and 2018. So just a little bit of background, as I'm sure everyone's familiar with this species, I'll be brief. The Hawaiian petrel is an endemic seabird found only in Hawaii. It's endangered. On islands where population trajectories are known, such as Kauaʻi, the population has declined dramatically in recent years. On Kauaʻi, between 1993 and 2013, it declined by 78%. So it's a species that is in peril. And there's a large breeding population of the species found on Lana'i. It's actually a very important population from an international perspective because of the numbers breeding on the island. The key threats to the species are power line collisions and light attraction, both related to human infrastructure, as well as introduced predators. These are cats, rats, pigs, and barn owls. At least pigs are not an issue on Lana'i. Habitat loss, invasive plants and ungulates destroying breeding habitat. And although poorly known, there are also threats at sea, and these would include things like overfishing, bycatch, climate change, and plastics, all things that we know impact seabirds globally. What we're going to do today is talk about the tracking project and specifically how it relates to threats to the species through collisions with power lines or development. And the way that we're going to do that is by talking about the tracking work that we've done, looking at flight paths of the birds as they pass overland from the sea to and from their colonies. So here's an example of the breeding areas where the birds breed. These beautiful aluhe covered slopes up on either side of the Monroe Trail on Lana'i. And over the 2 years, we worked in multiple colonies. In the first year in Hi'i, North Howla, and Kanoa, and then second year Hi'i only. And these are the devices that we use. These are from a company called EOBS in Germany. They're called the Bird Solar. They weigh 11 grams with all of the various bits and pieces that you have to use to attach them to the bird, which is just under 3% of the body weight, which is the recommended body weight ratio for tracking work. They have solar panels on them, so they charge when they're exposed to the sun, so that's great. They can keep on transmitting and charging. And they're also waterproof, obviously really important for seabird. And because Hawaiian petrels do sometimes dive after their prey, the pressure proofing is important on these two. They can be pressure proofed to at least 35 meters depth. It's not such a huge deal for the Hawaiian petrel because they don't dive as deep as mule shearwaters, which can dive up to 50 meters, but still it's important to have pressure proofing on these tags. The tags are pretty amazing in terms of the data that they collect. This is locational data, so it's GPS level data on the location of the bird, and also altitude. So these tags are really good at measuring the altitude of the bird in terms of how high it's flying above the ground, which is really important for studies such as these. And the thing I really love about these tags is that they download their data straight to base stations. So once you got the tag on the bird, you don't have to spend countless nights lurking in the bushes near burrows trying to recover the tag and get the data off it, because the tag will just download its data to base stations when it comes within range of a base station. Here's an example of the fieldwork associated with this project. So obviously we have to wait until it gets dark, which is when the birds come into their colonies. We set up these really high-tech burrow traps here. These are actually just lengths of tubing with a fashioned one-way door. And the idea here is that the bird will come into its burrow, push through the one-way door, go in and feed its chick, and then when it's ready to depart, it'll sit at the one-way door and not be able to get back out, and that's when we can actually catch them and tag them. It's really important that we allow the bird to get in and feed its chick first, so that all of the food and energy that it collects on its foraging trip is transferred to the young bird inside the burrow before it's tagged. And then you can see at the bottom there, two members of the team, that's Liz and Aaron, holding a bird as we're attaching the tag to it. On the bottom right, you can see how the tag looks on the bird. So we mount them to the bird's back. We use 4 surgical sutures to attach a small plastic plate to the bird's back, and then some small cable ties attach the tag to the plate. We did actually, in the first year, also try attaching them to the tail, but we found that the tags tend to fall off before we got a lot of usable data in many cases, and so we moved to the back mounts only for the 2019 season. And over the 2 years, we did 30 birds in total, so 20 in 2018 and 10 in 2019. These are the base stations, how the base stations look. So they're powered by a big solar panel. And then you can see that antenna sticking up. We've actually got this one mounted to a small tree. And as long as the bird and the tag have line of sight to the data logger, they will transmit the data to the base station. So what you're looking for are areas with good fields of view, ideally in areas where the bird's going to pass overhead. And in 2018, that map on the right, in 2019, that map on the right shows where we located the the base station. So 2 in the Hawaiian colony where we're tagging the birds, 1 in Kanoa because we knew that some of the birds fly in from the northeast, and then 1 down at the piggery. And then these are great. You just go and check but as often as you want, open up the base station itself, the data is saved to an SD card, and then you have the data available. So results. This is the map of all of our tracks of tagged birds in 2018 in yellow and 2019 in green. And you can see that basically in both years, the birds are following 2 main paths. In one case, they're coming into their colony from the south, and the other track that they use is coming in from the east-northeast. There's that one bird in 2018 in yellow that came in from the west, followed the northern coast, and then came in that direction. There's always one bird that does something different from everything else, but that was an anomaly. And as you can see, there's a very clear 2 main routes that the birds are using to get into their colony, regardless of what side of the Monroe Trail they were tagged on. So this slide shows us the outbound flight paths. Again, yellow is 2018 and green is 2019. And what you can see here is a different pattern from the inbound flights. In this case, all of the birds are basically just going out in the same direction. So they're taking a southwest to southeast route out to sea. Now, like I said, these tags will give you information on altitude. So let's have a little look at how the birds are flying as they go into their colony. So in this case, blue shows that the bird is basically at land or sea level. And then red is our highest, which is 400 meters above ground. And what you can see here for inbound tracks is that the birds come in low over the sea. Then they gain height significantly above the terrain before they reach the colony and end up at the burrow itself. And actually, anecdotally, I watched this earlier this year on Lana'i, sitting on the north side of the island. You can actually see birds coming in really high. It's as if they're coming in out of the clouds as they head up towards the colony. So they're certainly gaining a lot of height before they come into the where they're actually breeding. Conversely, for birds going outbound, these birds just have a gradual descent in altitude out to sea. So you can see here they're just cruising as they head on out, slowly losing elevation until they reach sea level. And looking at that a little bit closer, looking at the first point that the birds leave sea level going into the colonies, they start gaining altitude on average 1.5 kilometers from shore. Whereas birds that are heading out to sea, like I was saying before, they do cruise as they head on out, losing altitude gradually. They don't actually reach sea level until they're about, on average, 3.5 kilometers from shoreline. Now we've started looking at the results here, just a preliminary assessment based on wind patterns. And what it seems from our initial investigations of the data is that the birds will take that northeastern route if there's a good northeasterly wind coming in to hit Lana'i. And presumably that's because if there's a higher wind up there, then they can take advantage of that tailwind as they come in from that northeasterly route. However, if the wind is coming in from the east of the island, where it's mainly shielded by Maui, and there's not that northeast tailwind that they can utilize, then the birds just come in from the south because there's no benefit for them curving around the island to come in from the northeast. So some interesting stuff there, and we'll be pursuing that further this year when we continue to analyze the data. So the tracks are really interesting. It's really interesting to see the routes that these birds take in and out of the colony. But let's look at this more closely in terms of how can we use that flyway data to assess potential interactions with infrastructure or potential development. And we've done this on Kauaʻi fairly extensively. We've been looking at, on Kauaʻi we have a serious issue with power line collisions, and we've been monitoring power line collisions for many years. And we've actually used the data from our tracking work to look at routes that birds are taking over the island of Kauaʻi and where they're coming into contact, potential conflict and contact with the lines. You can see here, this is a track of a bird going into a colony called North Bog. And in the blue circle there, that's a bird flying high over power lines. You can see that that's flying over Lāhui, in that area of the island where you don't get very many power line collisions. But then that bird actually flies at a level under the power lines as it gets to the red circle, before heading into the colony. And that area there is an area called the Power Line Trail, which is actually where we have a very high number of power line collisions. It's one of the worst areas on the island. So you can see that this flight path data is really giving us some interesting insight into what the birds are doing as they pass over these power lines and why certain lines are worse than others. So let's just consider it from the Lana'i perspective and the data that we have. What I've done here is I've put 3 circles on the island. The blue ones are Lana'i City and Lana'i Airport, and then the red is Manele Bay. And what you can see here is that both on the inbound and outbound flights, the birds are not flying anywhere near or over Lana'i City or Lāhui Airport, whereas a lot of the birds are flying over Manele Bay. So that just gives you a heads up about where the birds are going and what areas could have potential issues for adult birds depending on how high they fly. I would like to point out here that these are adult breeding birds, and they don't indicate what the routes are that fledglings might use as they leave the island, although one could perhaps predict that the fledglings might use the same outbound routes as the adults. However, more work would be needed to understand what routes the fledglings take as they head out to sea. Now, what we did here was we added an overlay of the power line grid on Lana'i in lime green, and you can see here that again, the birds aren't flying over the majority of the power lines, but there's a very specific area on this island where there's a lot of birds flying over, both on inbound and outbound tracks. So we'll dive deeper into that one and look at the area in question. So you can see here that, again, with the red being birds flying high and blue be birds flying low, that actually the majority of birds that are flying over this stretch of line are flying high over the lines, which is good. That's both on the inbound and outbound flights. But as you can see in both cases, on the top one, you've got that bird Hape 2, an inbound flight. It was actually flying below the power line. And on the bottom right, you've got Hape 3 outbound. That bird's actually flying at or below the power line height. So certainly birds that are crossing over this area, although many of them are flying above the lines, there are certainly some that are flying at a level where they could collide with the power lines. Now, this brings us to the bird that was found by Palama Lana'i in June of this year. We've indicated on the map of the flyways as that red skull and crossbones. And as you can see, that bird was found under the power lines. There's very exposed lines right in the middle of where we're identifying it as being on a key flyway route. So we'd certainly suggest that the power line company consider this area as a potential power line collision threat risk. These birds are flying over here every single night, and there's many birds up in the mountains of Lana'i, and even if a small proportion of them every night are flying at power line level, that means there are very serious collision risks, as this bird that was found this year shows. And there are some simple ways of dealing with this. On the one level, you can actually take the line out of the flyway by undergrounding it, but if you can't do that, then another thing to do would be to attach diverters to this power line. Diverters we've been using on Kauaʻi now to prevent power line collisions, and we found with our preliminary studies that they have a really good effect of reducing power line strikes. And the idea behind them is that you attach them to the power lines to make the lines more visible to the birds, because remember, the birds are flying past them at night. There are both LED diverters, which have blinking lights on them, and non-LED. And we'd encourage the power line company to think about one or the other of those at the very least, as well as thinking about monitoring this area further for collision risk. Lastly, we did also find some interesting circling behavior of a couple of the birds that we tagged. Circling is often indicative of light attraction. As you can see from our earlier maps, the vast majority of birds are just heading straight into the colony or straight out of the colony. They're not deviating their flight. Whereas these birds, in both 2018 and 2019, we found that a couple of birds were circling over this particular area. We have identified a couple of potential light attraction sources. There's a structure up there on the sort of northwestern side of the map, and also the piggery. It would be good to investigate this further to see if there are light issues in this area, because these birds are certainly circling for a reason. And if there is a light attraction issue there, then we should think about how we could actually reduce it by keeping lights off or shielding lights or reducing, changing the light type. So that's the thrust of our talk. The last thing I did want to do is just highlight to everyone some of the information we got about the birds' foraging areas, because Hawaiian petrels in particular have a fascinating foraging strategy, and the birds on Lana'i are no different. So this is the flight paths of the long trips that adults are taking to feed their chicks. So just to back up a little bit, the Hawaiian petrel employs a long trip, short trip foraging strategy. So what you get is one member of the pair is going to take this long trip, which as you can see here is this huge arcing trip, almost 10,000 kilometers on average up towards Alaska and back again. Takes almost just over 3 weeks. And this is what one of the birds will be doing. And it's a pretty epic journey, particularly when you think about this being a bird doing this journey to feed its chick. In the meantime, the other bird is using the short trips. So it's doing multiple short trips while the other bird is doing the long trip. On average, these were just a couple of days in length and a couple of 100 kilometers. And the Lana'i birds are all heading out to the southwest of the island. Which if you think back to the outbound tracks, this is exactly what the outbound birds were all heading in this direction towards. So these huge arcing long trips for one adult, and the other one is doing these short trips. It's a pretty fascinating foraging strategy for the birds. And interestingly enough, while the long trips, the Lana'i birds are doing what birds tagged on Kauaʻi and Big Island also do, we found that the short trips are different. So on the left here, we have a heat map showing where the short trips are concentrated for birds coming out of Lana'i. And this here on the right-hand side is the birds coming out from the Kauaʻi colonies, and they're all going into the northern area. So there's a complete segregation of feeding areas for birds doing short trips, which is pretty fascinating. So in conclusion, traditionally birds, when you tag seabirds, you're doing it to assess at-sea foraging areas. But these data loggers present a powerful tool for understanding overland flight patterns too. Overland flight path data that's collected is really useful because it can help identify potential collision hotspots and light attraction areas. And it can also help guide new development. If you see that the birds are heavily utilizing an area over the airspace above where a new development is going to occur, then you can think of the ways in which you can, ahead of schedule, you can think of ways in which you could minimize any potential interactions with the birds. And lastly, these tracks can help highlight where to concentrate mitigation measures in key areas for maximum effect. So like that section of the power line that we looked at earlier, that's certainly an area where you would want to concentrate mitigation measures to prevent power line collisions. And by doing that, you could save a significant number of birds that are breeding on the population on Lana'i. So lastly, I'd just like to thank everyone for listening, also all of my co-authors, and all of the people involved in KESR, PCSU, DOFA, and Palama Lana'i who have worked so hard to make this study happen and to make it successful. Thank you very much.